Hey, hello everyone. I'm Richard Herskowitz. I'm the artistic and executive director of the Ashland Independent Film Festival. And we are here with the director of the film you just saw, Swoon, and the cinematographer of the film, Ellen Kuras. So Tom Kalin and Ellen Kuras are here. We're going to be talking about the film. The film was made in 1992, and it was actually the first feature film for both of you. Tom, the film premiered at Sundance. You and Ellen won Best Cinematography there for the film, and it went on to win awards in Berlin, Stockholm, the Gotham Film Festival. And of course, it's become a real classic and one of the key films that Ruby Rich identified as launching the new queer cinema movement. She actually wrote that article in 1992, identifying the movement, and your film was one of the spurs to this whole concept and movement. So let's start with you, Tom. Just maybe give us a little bit of background about the film, what inspired you to dramatize Leopold and Loeb and do this as an indie feature.
Well, thank you, Richard, for hosting this and for the wonderful hospitality in the festival and the vision of bringing this as a digital event, which is so needed in this time when we're also separated. So thank you. I grew up as the youngest of 11 children in Chicago. My parents were born in 1917 and 1920, so both of them were alive when the Leopold and Loeb murder case happened. And they both grew up with awareness of it. As a child, there was a kind of joke in my household, you better behave or Leopold and Loeb will come and get you. So they really were kind of like folkloric characters, and they were as famous as characters from the Manson murders. They were, a crime that really shocked my parents' generation. I saw pictures of them, I don't know at what age, but young, probably like 12 or 13. I had a grandmother actually that was very interested in true crime and kind of had a lurid imagination. So it may have been at her house that I saw the pictures. And I was really smitten by these dashing young 18 and 19-year-old boys. And as a, not out of the closet teenager, I sensed there was something between the two of them. Mm-hmm. So yeah, years went by before I even ever considered making films. I was an actor as a teenager, and then I went to art school and studied painting, mm-hmm. and finally kind of found my way into filmmaking after in my 20s. And as I was looking for a story to think about, I came back to this idea of this crime because it embedded so much that I was interested in, mm-hmm. because it was a crime that dealt with, power relationships and intellectual culture in the 20s and, the very early roots of, what would become known as gay identity, but at that time wasn't really known as gay identity. It was just more a behavior shared by these two young men.
So I see that you connected with some of the leading lights of the emerging indie feature movement in New York, that is Christine Vachon, James Schamus. I even saw a little bit of a credit for Todd Haynes in the film.
It's true. I was lucky enough at ACT UP so ACT UP was the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, an AIDS activist group that was formed in 1987, largely by Larry Kramer and people surrounding him. And that organization helped to release the life-saving drugs that changed the AIDS crisis in America in the mid-90s. Todd Haynes and Christine Vachon were both members of ACT UP. Mm-hmm. I met Todd Haynes in ACT UP. We both had a fondness for marijuana, which mm-hmm. we still share to this day. So I helped Todd procure that illegal substance. He kindly invited me to a screening of a film that he had made called Superstar, the Karen Carpenter story, which was a film telling the story of anorexic Karen Carpenter told entirely with Barbie dolls. It's now legendary. It seems like a crazy idea, but it was an incredibly moving film. And it was just the kind of movies I wanted to make. So I wrote Todd a fan letter, actually, when I was very, it's like we'd known each other kind of as acquaintances. And I wrote a letter saying, that's the kind of film I want to make. And I'm so admire what you're doing. And I hope that I can learn, get to know you better and learn more about the way that you think about filmmaking. So it's through Todd I meet Christine Vachon. Mm-hmm. And they, at that time, had a company called Apparatus. Mm-hmm. Todd and Christine had both gone to school with Ellen Kuras, the cinematographer. So it's actually through Christine Vachon, who knew Ellen's work prior to that, from me knowing it. She introduced me to Ellen. Ellen had shot a short film called Samsara, which is this incredibly beautifully lyrically shot documentary. And they all came from a kind of related culture. They had all studied semiotics and film culture. So it was really the first way in was Todd and Christine. And from those connections, a lot of other people, like some of the actors, for instance, from the Wooster group and other people entered
Ron Vaughtner, yeah.
Exactly.
So Ellen, from your perspective and your recollection of the time being approached to do the film, what did it mean to you?
Well, I had met Christine through some friends, and I basically met her. I remember one afternoon at Brown because I was a year older than she and Todd. So I never shared any classes with them. And I had done my semiotics work in France. So I never really took any semiotics classes at Brown. So the one time I met Christine is when I went to the new media center, which was basically a rolling cart with a monitor on it or a TV and a VCR. And that was the new media center. And then I met her afterwards through some friends. And she, at that time, she had formed Apparatus with the trust fund of Barry Ellsworth. So she and Todd and Barry got together and made this new consortium between them to make independent cinema. And I had actually known her. I worked with her when I was an AC for my then boyfriend at the time, who was shooting for Todd. And then afterwards, she knew that I was starting to make this film, and she knew about Samsara. So one day she calls me up and she says, "Hey, we're doing another film for Apparatus. I want to put you up to be the cinematographer, but send me your reel." And I said, I don't really have a reel. I was just doing my work, and I'd never really put anything together. So, and it made me really nervous because I hadn't really, I didn't know what work to put on it. I was so fresh at what I was doing. So a week later, she ran into me again. We ran into each other on the street, and she was like, "Give me your work. I don't care what it is. Just give it to me on VHS tapes." It was VHS at the time. So I gave her what I had. She showed it to Tom. And when I met Tom, it was really interesting because we didn't talk about the script for the first hour of our conversation. We just talked about ideas. We talked about meaning and ideas and how meaning is made. And we talked about a lot of different things about life and perspective. And then we started getting to the script. And so at the time, there was another guy, cinematographer, who was up for the job, who had done 2 features. He was definitely the person that everybody thought would get the job. And here I was, I had never shot a feature before, never shot anything dramatic before, never shot anything in black and white, and certainly had never done anything period. So, but Tom and I just connected, and so he asked me to do the film.
So as I understand it, this was your 16 millimeter camera that was used for this, and shooting in black and white, doing this pretty low budget, right? I mean, I think I read somewhere $25,000.
To get the fortune, we shot basically, so in 1990, in the summer of 1990, we shot for 10 days. So we essentially ran out of money. There's a bunch of scenes in the film, for instance, there's an interrogation scene that's shot against entirely white walls. And we whip pan and move through, and Ellen does a sort of beautiful job of making that empty white room into an actual space. But after we had done that a number of times, I realized, and also I didn't have all the story beats in place. I was missing things. So we stopped. That first shoot is $25,000, those first 10 days. We wrap for 8 months. We do more fundraising, and we shoot for an additional 4 days. Those 4 days, we do certain key things. Like the first time the murder scene is shot, I'm so afraid of my own material. I shoot the murder in a black box studio with all kinds of fragmentation and not using a car, not using the real location. And we saw the footage and instantly realized it just looked like a silly art movie. We realized, you have to put the viewer in the car with the characters and really let them see murder this boy and really have it be an emotionally charged experience. So the second shoot was probably about, I don't know, $10,000 for those remaining 4 days. And then in order to get the film, we finished in 16 mil, we shot in 16 millimeter, transferred to U-matic video, 3/4 video is what I edited the film on. So using not a digital system, but a straight cut system. And then we matched back to that 16 millimeter and blew up from 16 millimeter to 35 millimeter. To get to 35 millimeter, the whole budget of the film is about $225,000. So, you know, it's comparable to today's micro budget features, shot very quickly. Ellen was a miracle maker. You know, Ellen won the cinematography prize at Sundance for a film that she never saw any dailies on. None, literally none. And the only check was her taking black and white Polaroids, little, like, you know, 3-inch by 4-inch Polaroids, which we would look at on set and be like, oh, that looks great, let's shoot.
Well, just watching it again, like I did a couple of days ago, I mean, just the visual style is so striking. Where you talk about the very spare sets, the emphasis on the close-ups, with rare kind of establishing shots, kind of the focus is on the faces, and the whip hands across. Could you talk a little bit about that? Again, arriving at the visual style.
I mean, we didn't have a studio. I mean, it's interesting because when we did that first murder scene, remember we did it in I lived on Broome Street, and my housemate at the time was out of town. So we used that room, that spare room. You know, I mean, we dragged the equipment up a walk up, and, you know, everybody got paid $100 from the PAs to me to everybody. And, you know, we were constantly giving money back to try and get an extra piece of track or whatever. I mean, you know, we made that money on nothing because we didn't even have a regular dolly. We had a doorway dolly. And the biggest light that I had was a 5K. And so and we didn't have there were video taps had just come out at the time. We didn't have a video tap. And what that experience really taught me, and I think taught Tom at the time too, was the fact that, you know, we learned how to do a lot with a little, you know. So part of the aesthetic of it being spare was in function of us thinking creatively about how can we make this look stylized in a way that's in keeping with the story, and then also that's within our budget. So, you know, so we learned how to do so much with 1 or 2 lights, and Tom and I had to be absolutely in sync, you know, because he couldn't see what I was seeing. You know, he would be right next to the camera, but there was no video tap. There was no monitor. I mean, it was like the old days in cinema. You know, he looks at the cinematographer and he says, how was that? And I'm like, it was great. Or we have to go again. So the trust factor was huge. And I think that people nowadays, they don't have the same relationship because you don't have to be in each other's head as much. You know, it's much more literal and in front of us. Don't you agree, Tom?
I do, totally. I think that there's a way of working, you know, not having video tap, having to have that very strong line of trust and connection between me and Ellen. And also, she understood that she was the custodian of performance, not just framing. Ellen still, when I'm on set, is the first person I trust about performance because there's no better ability to observe performance through the viewfinder. Ellen has a particular kind of curse/gift of she has hearing problem in the ear that doesn't face the camera. So it puts her in a particular bubble, actually. It's like her observation abilities are very heightened, I think. And so it's not just about the aesthetic of the image, it's about the meaning of the image. It's about the emotion of the image. I was very lucky in the late 1980s, like 87 or 88, the Whitney Museum preserved Andy Warhol's films. I don't know if you know, but Warhol's films, and by Warhol's films, I mean not the movies directed by Paul Morrissey, like Flesh, Trash, and Heat, but the actual films directed by Andy, of which there are literally thousands of them. I saw a bunch of the films from the mid-'60s, and Warhol films are often misunderstood to be badly shot, out of focus. It's not true. They're elegantly minimal. They are powerful in their use of off-screen space. They make you imagine a much bigger world than they show you. So I think the 3 biggest influences, thinking back, are Warhol, Derek Jarman, and Cocteau. Derek Jarman, I was mercilessly copying in the idea of making something that was ambiguous about period. You know, for the viewers who just watched the movie and think that I don't know that there was a touch-tone phone in 1924, I know there was no touch-tone phone in 1924. But what I would say to them is, did you realize that there was no possibility of a black female stenographer in 1924? And that by casting a black woman to play the stenographer's role, when the women are asked to leave the courtroom, I'm actually asking the audience to consider the question, if the stenographer was female and left, how would we have this historical record? So throughout the film, I was trying to use these choices to make the viewer ask questions about history, ask questions about the period they were looking at.
Yes, and that brings me to one of the most striking things about the film. And now that I've seen a number of your short films, I see the use of archival images is something that is really part of your aesthetic continuously through this day. Could you say something about that? Is there an influence of collage film in there? Where does that come from?
For sure. I mean, my background, I didn't, for the people who are watching this who are filmmakers and come up through narrative film, I didn't really make narrative shorts. So there are no narrative shorts before my feature. All the short work I made was experimental or essay film or video art. So yes, you know, going all the way back to the West Coast-based filmmakers like Bruce Conner, who I was, you know, very inspired by. But there are generations of filmmakers, you know, somebody like Woody Allen making Zelig, for instance, a much bigger budget movie or bigger platform for a movie, but still using archive in a thoughtful way. In Swoon, it was also practical because, you know, we could only rent one period car. So anytime I needed a wide shot or, you know, a group shot or anything practically, archival was helpful. It was interesting doing that because some of that archival was nitrate negative, which is very flammable. So one of the expenses in our budget was actually ensuring the shipping of that explosive archival footage to get it copied.
Tom, could you say anything about the film, looking back on it now, and being part of this movement, this new queer cinema movement, and what was really fresh and different about it compared to other gay-themed films at the time?
I think you could look at pretty much many of the films from the new queer cinema film period as films that are dealing with the rage and despair of AIDS, of the AIDS crisis. It's explicitly in Greg Araki's movie The Living End. It exists as metaphor in Todd Haynes's Poison. And though Swoon is not an allegory about AIDS, it's not, you know, I'm not expressing something about AIDS. I am expressing my feelings of rage about the culture at that moment. The thing that really impacted me personally, there's a famous sodomy case called the Hardwick decision. It's a Georgia sodomy case where a man was arrested for consensual sodomy, having sex with another man in his bedroom, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And at that time, in the 80s, they ruled that consensual sodomy was illegal in the privacy of the bedroom. That literally led to the idea of putting the bedroom in the courtroom in Swoon, because it literally felt like the bed I was having sex on was being judged by a bunch of white judges, white male judges. So I think of the movie still carries some of the things we should be angry about in our society, the lack of equity. I believed in making the film, especially in this idea of equal opportunity homicide, which is to say that films are a place that we imagine doing things we cannot do in real life. Sometimes that involves taking a balloon and flying to the moon. Sometimes that's about becoming, going and taking the golden, follow the yellow brick road to, a fantastic place. But sometimes fantasy in film is a dark thing. And the idea of, heterosexuality is so durable. There's such a long history in film noir of heterosexual characters, having erotic fixations with each other and murdering. Nobody ever looks at Double Indemnity and says, oh, those nutty heterosexuals, they had so much sex it caused them to murder. So there was also that idea that I wanted not just to say that queers were capable of marriage and happiness, but that queers, just like heterosexuals, should have the luxury of having bad behavior.
Yeah, and in that way, Swoon and other films of the period were breaking away from the idea that films had to present positive images, like a film like Longtime Companion, I guess, which was relatively contemporary.
Although Longtime Companion occupies a very particular place for several reasons. Christine worked, I assume you might know, Christine worked on that film for Bill Sherwood. Bill Sherwood also met me and Todd like Todd had done something, so Bill Sherwood had a reason to be nice to Todd. I had done nothing. And I cannot think of a more encouraging, I mean, he was amazing to me. The casting director in Swoon, Dan Hoy, was the casting director of Parting Glances. He also appears in the film as the bird shop salesman. He has a teeny role. Todd Haynes is a teeny role. Todd Haynes is one of the heads you see in the section of the prisoners.
So I have the sense that again, featuring these gay anti-heroes and not being afraid that this was going to reinforce stereotypes, that wasn't something that inhibited you in making this film.
Well, I mean, it's funny to think back of the timing. Two of the key movies of that period are Silence of the Lambs and Basic Instinct. It's a little hard to imagine. I'm no diss to Basic Instinct totally, but it's kind of hard to imagine we talk of those two movies in the same breath, because I think of Silence of the Lambs as a near masterpiece, and I think of Basic Instinct as just a funny, guilty entertainment. Christine and I got into big trouble. Christine would be like, a movie about lesbians who kill straight men with an ice pick? What's the problem? So, we joked about it. And Silence of the Lambs, I said this then, I'm indebted to Ruby Rich, who I'm actually paraphrasing. Ruby pointed out, the movie is not a homophobic movie. The movie is a feminist movie in which a female protagonist solves the crime, not by using flirtation or coquetry, but by her brain, by her expertise. And that also the trans representation in the film, I never found homophobic. So, yeah, I mean, I think there was a kind of moment when these things were highly charged. In retrospect, a movie I challenged at the time, Longtime Companion, which to me seemed like a movie in a bubble about AIDS, about a bunch of rich gay men who could afford summer rentals on Fire Island. At that time, that movie seemed not about my experience of AIDS. Now I see that movie through a more gentle lens. I think as you age, I look at that period of time in a kind of more nuanced way than I did when I was 25.
Ellen, thinking back on this film in relation to films you made later, were there some things that you took from the making of the film? One thing that I read someplace was that the use of zoom lenses was something that you were a little concerned about, that there was an impression that using a zoom lens was just not serious cinematography, but you did use it on this film and found that you really valued it. Is this true?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, we at the time, to be considered a real cinematographer, if you were doing something dramatic or you're doing a feature, you're supposed to be using all prime lenses, because that's the way you do it. It's like if you're doing a feature, you have to use prime lenses. Zoom lenses were only used for documentary, and zoom lenses were used, they were developed in the 70s, and people did use zoom lenses. I mean, when you look at certain films that were done in New York, they were everybody was obsessed with the zoom. But we didn't really have the money. I mean, we were using my camera package. I happened to have two zoom lenses. I had a Cook lens and I had a Zeiss. And so that's what we had. And so, because we were on such a limited budget, the thing about the discovery about the zoom lens that was great was that sometimes, we would do a move on our doorway dolly, and then I would be able to just continue the move and zoom in a little bit, which gave great emotional effect at the end. And I was able to control that. It wasn't like I was telling somebody else to do it. And which is, in when you get into the higher echelons of zooming in the old world with Panavision lenses, in the old days, the assistant would be zooming. But because it's such a visceral feeling when you're reacting to what an actor is doing, the fact that I was able to just push in slightly just heightened that moment ever so much. So for me, later on, it was only after, we had done Swoon and I was about to do this film called Angela, and I met Sven Nykvist, who is the famous, cinematographer who worked with Bergman. And I asked Sven, I said, listen, everybody says that in order to be a real cinematographer, which I think is a bit sexist anyway, to be a real cinematographer, you have to use prime lenses. I said, but I actually made a whole film on the zoom and I really liked it. And he was like, oh, he goes, I always use the zoom lens. You just tell them, Sven says you can do whatever you want. And after that, it was freed me to do, I just thought, I'm not going to listen to anybody. I'm just going to do what I feel. And so Tom and I, that was an invaluable experience, because I think we both noticed, using the zoom lens had this kind of visceral, emotional appeal to it. Don't you think, Tom?
Totally. I also think it's so interesting to think about Ellen's work in the 90s, because like a bunch of iconic movies for style, Ellen shot Unzipped. Unzipped is like, could not be more quoted as a fashion documentary. And I just think there's a kind of, but I think it's interesting because because it came from a place of like rigor and ideas and connecting things. So that and also because, yes, we're both superficial enough people to adore beauty, adore it. But I can't really deal with beauty separated from content. So, I mean, what prevented me in my career from going into fashion was that actually I had all the instincts and the aesthetics. I could have been wildly involved in fashion, but there wasn't enough rigor of the mind. And that I think is, we both shared that, which is a kind of languorous, luxurious appreciation of highly heightened aesthetics, but also a kind of intellectual rigor where that thing existed at the service of an idea. And having those two things, and also because there was a tradition of the left and there was a tradition of intellectual filmmaking that was ugly, frankly, that didn't have an aesthetic. And I was like, no. We're going to make a movie that's politically charged and beautiful at the same time. And I think that's something we have in common. And I also think you can see it in Ellen's work with different directors, because, it's Ellen's work has a character of its own, but she's enough of a chameleon that there's different character and different flavor. And those films, I think a lot of those films, a film to this day, I think is profoundly influential and should have won the Academy Award for her, is Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Yes. And it's a movie that, so low key in its aesthetic, but so original, so influential.
Well, Tom, Ellen, thank you both for participating in our discussion. Now, I just want to point out that, and I neglected to mention at the beginning, that Tom is the recipient of this year's Pride Award. Appropriately, you're the successor to last year's Pride Award winner, B. Ruby Rich, so appropriately. And we are going to be featuring your short films tomorrow. People should come back and see. There's a program of short films that Tom has made since they are lost to vision altogether, which he made 2 or 3 years before Swoon, all the way through the present. Some very strongly political films, music videos. It's an amazing program. I highly recommend it.
Yeah, everybody should see those films, because Tom is such a visionary. I mean, the things that he has done just really blow my mind. So really, if you want, it's a visual orgasm. So.
And speaking of fashion, if you want to see my one and only fashion collaboration with Ellen, there's a very rarely seen film called Jeffrey Bean 30, which is from 1993, shot just after Swoon, based on a fan letter from the fashion designer Jeffrey Bean, featuring Marcia Gay Harden and actually Claire Danes in one of her very first roles when she was a teenager. And also the Swedish actress Vivica Lindfors in one of her very last roles. It's a remarkable movie we made with no dialogue. And there's a bunch of other shorts as well, so come and take a look.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Ellen.
Thanks so much, Richard.
Bye.
Great to see you. Bye, Ellen. Bye, everybody. We'll see you soon. All right, bye.